Right, thank you all for joining us today for our finals. A couple of ground rules. Kindly do not bang on the table while speakers are speaking. Also, be as quiet as possible and support them the respect they deserve as we will earn their place in this finale. With that said, we're going to start soon. I'm Gordon Joseph, I'll be your chair. I'm joined by Kojo, Kulu, Kula, Adam, Michelle, Dante, and Floyd. That said, Kula will keep time for you. That said, we welcome the Prime Minister to start this debate. Yeah. Right, thank you. Sorry, William, wouldn't you want to prefer to use the mic?
I prefer. Panel, entrapment was used by Rudy Giuliani's early 2000s New York government to try and tackle the extent of crime that was occurring in New York. The resulting effect was crime dropped by 67% in the next 5 years. We're going to tell you that entrapment helps us to fight crime in the most ravaged crime areas of the world's biggest cities. We're going to present 3 arguments to you. Firstly, I'm going to tell you why the government needs to find proactive ways of engineering social compliance and abidance to law. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why this is a legitimate policy when it comes to determining complicity for crime. And thirdly, I'm going to tell you why this encourages effective investigation techniques. But before we do that, we need to establish some important context. The first is that entrapment is not going to replace the ordinary range of activities that police pursue when they are pursuing crime. We say the police would ordinarily consult the wide array of tools that they ordinarily use, such as investigation, such as trying to collect evidence and data before entrapment is used. It's largely used as a last resort. Secondly, why is it largely used as a last resort? We say in order for an entrapment to be effective, it needs to happen in circumstances in which individuals are likely to encounter the criminal activity that is being facilitated. That is to say that entrapment only happens in areas where the community is being ravaged by that particular crime, be it human trafficking, be it gangsterism, or be it drug possession. So we're telling you that this policy is happening in the worst affected areas of crime within society. The third thing we need to establish then is, what is the punishment likely going to be? We say that we are perfectly happy to allow for mitigating factors that would give people who are victims of entrapment a lighter sentence relatively to those who would have committed the crime otherwise in other circumstances. We think that, for example, like the New York government in the early 2000s, we would promote constructive ways of punishing these people, such as sentencing them to do important things such as community service. But even if that wasn't the case, we are perfectly happy to accept adverse consequences for these individuals, because we think in other circumstances where you have demonstrated a propensity to be socially deviant, you would have otherwise committed a crime anyway in the future. So, let's establish why we firstly think that the state needs to have ways of proactively preventing crime in society. We think that the state currently is not realizing its full burden. That is to say, it only discourages crime ex post facto and can only do so retrospectively, meaning that the only way it deters society from committing crime, that is to say, changing the calculus that people make when they're evaluating whether or not to commit a crime, is in sentencing. So giving criminals harsh sentences so that the rest of society is discouraged from committing crime because they're equally afraid of that harsh sentence. But the reason why we don't think that works is that firstly, it is reliant on a crime occurring in the first place, but secondly, it doesn't work, and we don't think it's fair because it requires disproportionately punishing people who have committed crimes so that you can deter the rest of society. But another reason why it doesn't work is because in a lot of these communities, people don't fear the threat of punishment because because you're unlikely going to be caught by the police. So we say that is the very condition that allows crime to thrive in these areas, and thus you need a proactive way of engineering social behavior. We think we proactively and prospectively engineer social behavior at the point in which you as an individual who's walking on the streets of New York, walking on the streets of Bogota, or walking on the streets of Lagos are afraid of committing a crime because there's a higher chance that the person who is facilitating that transaction is likely going to be an officer of the law. We think at the point in which that becomes a present part of your reality and lived experience, that community requisitely is unlikely to commit crime, and we say that the police should always consult ways of prospectively preventing crime in society, because we think it shouldn't rely on people's rights being infringed on the first place so that it can protect people's rights. It should try to do so prospectively. But secondly, let's establish why we think this policy is legitimate. What we tell you here is that everything is happening organically except for the fact that the police are predetermining the place, the time, and the location. We think that everything else within the interaction is precisely natural and happens naturally, right? We think in that dynamic in which a person is encountering this police officer, that is a dynamic and an encounter that they otherwise would have ordinarily or in their lifetime likely to have encountered, meaning that their willingness to commit crime is an indication that they have a propensity to be socially deviant, and we think that in that sense you are deserving of punishment because you are complicit. But secondly, we're going to use an analogy to illustrate why this is precisely the case. We think that the intervention of a police officer is arbitrary, right? Because the principle here is that if the circumstance had been similar, you would have behaved in the exact same way. So we think it's arbitrary that it was a police officer who was present. We think the way we can compare this principle existing in current law is we don't think we absolve people who were stopped from committing crime by police officers just because they were stopped by police officers. We still punish them for attempted murder or attempted rape because we understand that the presence or intervention of a police officer does not absolve you from being complicit. And equally in this circumstance, we would say you should not be absolved of being complicit because just because the conditions have been created by the police officer, we think you still had the final choice within that situation as to how you would act. And in many cases, police officers are reluctant to be aggressive to enabling you to commit crime because they want to give you a chance to demonstrate that you can be redeemed. So we think there is a double reason why that is the case. I'll quickly take closing, yes.
Well, if you don't believe in the idea of absolvement, why are you giving them a lighter sentence? Why is there a disparity in terms of the justice system in your model?
We would give them a lighter sentence because we understand that in some ways the conditions have been fabricated, but importantly, the question is about whether or not these people should be absolved of being complicit, which you say isn't the case. That is the important consideration that you've ignored. But thirdly, why do we think this improves investigation techniques in these communities? What we need to understand here is we're talking about communities where it is very difficult for the police to penetrate, given that they are largely under the control of things such as crime bosses, gangs, that literally determine the way these communities function. That is to say that it's very difficult for police to encourage people to do things such as provide evidence. So we need a way in which we can access these people, and we think this is one of them, because those people can provide us useful information about the criminal activities that are happening in these communities, and that is information that we can elicit from these individuals, and we think it's particularly important because of that. Secondly, a lot of these areas are poor. That is to say that the local policing officers don't have the resources to constantly be present to make sure that crime is regulated within those communities, and we say that is why this is a useful way of understanding exactly why and how crime happens within those specific areas. We think by accessing these people, we have a viable avenue of making sure that the people at the top who are creating the crime in the first place, i.e. the pimps, the gang bosses, and the kingpins, are the ones that eventually will be targeted and will be removed off the streets. We think that this is a very effective way of making sure that society is safe, especially society's most vulnerable communities. It is for those reasons that I'm very proud to propose.
Right, we thank the Prime Minister for starting the debate for opening government, and now call on the Leader of Opposition to start the debate for opening opposition. Just give us a moment.
Yeah? Or can I start?
Right, thank you.
Shh. I don't know. Master Chair, my dream has always been to win Jozi Rumble wearing sweatpants, and William has made it all the more easier. Because what William forgets in today's case is he forgets the way in which policemen behave in the most adverse situations, especially in contexts where racial profiling is a thing, especially in contexts where people's material conditions mean that they are more likely to commit those crimes, and at such a point where police are treating socioeconomic sensitivities as a simple game. That's what we have a problem with in today's debate, right? So there are three things I'm going to speak about in my speech. Firstly is the idea of reforming the criminal justice system. Secondly, the idea of profiling. And thirdly, community relationships, which Maxine is largely going to expand on. But essentially, the framework that we needed in today's debate is what the role of the police is, and that's to maintain law and order, number one. But secondly, is to make themselves a bridge between the community and the state, so that the community understands the importance of keeping law and order. And what you do under a policy like entrapment is that you break that trust and you break the buy-in that people have with the police, right? I'll integrate most of my rebuttal into my matter. However, there are a few isolated issues that we need to deal with, right? So we get this idea from William, like the scenario that he places it in, is that in New York in the 1990s, Rudy Giuliani, the former Republican mayor, had this policy of entrapment. He also had a large number of other problematic policies, such as racial profiling and such as stop and frisk. Stop and frisk disproportionately affected black people. Give us an example of an outdated crime practice which Michael Bloomberg in the 2000s stopped completely, is completely disingenuous to the sort of society that we live in. There's a reason why we stopped those practices. It's not the 1960s and 70s where we enjoy crime-busting action-type cops who put black people in prison because it's impressive to sensitive white parents, right? That's very problematic, and those are the sensitivities that they're forgetting in today's debate. But over and above that, we get this idea that you engineer behavior within communities and you make people afraid of committing crimes. We say for shame to this. Why do we say that? Because not only do you break the trust that people have with the cops, but particularly African-American communities in the US and black communities in South Africa have what's called the no snitching rule, which is you don't tell the cops about the crimes that happen within our community because these are community problems. What you do under this problem is that you create a further distrust between the police and predominantly black communities who will exacerbate rules like the no snitch rule, which means genuine crimes like rape and murder will never get reported to the police because the community doesn't trust them. Not take it, right? So on my first idea around reforming the criminal justice system, and what we say here is that the orthodox around the criminal justice system has largely changed in the last couple of years. William placing this debate in a 1990s trigger-happy, Rambo-type Republican criminal justice system policy is completely disingenuous to the age that we live in, right? Because in the era of the war on drugs, from the 1970s to the 1990s, it was ideal that cops were violent, that cops put the baddies away, and that cops didn't understand the sensitivities of poor communities. It was ideal that cops were tough and rugged and didn't actually delve into why black kids predominantly use crack and why black kids are the ones who are likely to get arrested, right? And in the contemporary age, when we're fighting things like the war on drugs, when we're fighting things like the stop and frisk policy, it's incredibly important because our police are becoming sensitive to the issues of these communities. We want our police to understand why it is that black kids predominantly use crack and why black kids predominantly have to steal and so on. Putting them in conditions where they're tempted to commit actions that they wouldn't have committed if someone hadn't tempted them is completely racist and incredibly insensitive sensitive to the sort of material conditions that those kids live in and the reasons for why they chose that option in the first place. You essentially turn their material conditions into a mere game that the police can play with to throw away the baddies in jail, right? And that's very problematic. But over and above that, it messes with the court system, right? Because there's a disjunction between the way that the court processes crime and the manner in which entrapment works. Things like gathering evidence and so on. And that's particularly problematic in today's debate, right? So we don't want the 1960s, 70s cop that William presents to us. We want a contemporary cop, one that is engaged with the community and understands the sensitivities of why it is that these kids commit the crimes that they do. Secondly, on my issue of profiling, and what we say here is that entrapment is capturing the low-hanging fruit, right? It's lazy police work, it's very shoddy police work that doesn't concentrate on investigating complex crime networks, but instead goes into communities with well-meaning, like predominantly poor kids who are predominantly black, and tempting them into like buying drugs, right? Because it's an escape from their material conditions, tempting them to commit violent actions because it's an escape from their material conditions. This is low-hanging fruit, right? Because what OG tells us is that they want to predominantly go into those violent communities, which have brown faces, unfortunately, right? Where the poor are most likely to commit those sort of vices. That's particularly problematic. I show you the example of Fees Must Fall, where the police started provoking strategic leaders like Ndlovu, Dlamini, and Khumalo to make sure that they reacted in a violent manner so they could throw them into prison, right? That's the sort of entrapment that already exists even within protest culture, and it's going to look exactly like that with things like drugs and other sort of crimes, right? So we don't want the police using their power and abusing it to put strategic people in jail, especially in communities where racial profiling is a huge problem, where mass incarceration is a huge problem, and there's a disproportionate representation of black people within prison, right? We want our police to be sensitive to community needs, and at the end of the day, we don't want like an adverse conservative society being fine with the idea of brown faces behind prison, because this is low-hanging fruit and it's a cheap shot. Yes?
Would you agree that it is important and necessary for a community to have faith in its criminal justice system and police?
100%, which takes me to my next point on community trust. And what we say here is that you're breaking that trust. The reason you're breaking that trust is because every single black mother or every single poor mother, whether in America or South Africa, will lose their faith in the police system that puts their son in jail, tempted their son to use drugs or steal or act in a violent manner. That's why you end up getting the no snitching rule, the rule that says we're not talking to the cops as a community, we're not engaging with the cops as a community, and what that manifests to is we're not engaging with the government as a community at all. We're creating this isolated this isolated environment that is away from the state, that is divorced from the state, but over and above that, a society that is divorced from law and order. The reason why the crack epidemic ruined the black community within America in the 1980s and 90s is because of this distrust. It's because of people not wanting to report gangsters, people not wanting to report crimes in their communities, because they simply don't trust the police. You allow those problems to fester within the community, and that's particularly problematic in today's debate. So the side that wins today's debate is the side that can show us why the recent drop in crime rate in places like the US and even in South Africa, despite the fact that we don't use entrapment anymore, why those aren't a legitimate means of stopping crime, and why targeting low-hanging fruit and taking cheap shots at poor communities with many sensitivities is a legitimate form of fighting crime. We're very proud to report.
Right, we thank the Leader of Opposition for starting the case for closing opposition, and I'll call on the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the case for the opening government.
Panel, it's my dream to add Jozi to my collection of trophies. and this is how I'm going to do it. First of all, we're going to be the side that's most genuine to the sort of needs that communities that are crime-ridden have. Secondly, we're the side that's going to principally defend why it's legitimate to do anything that can accentuate policing as a practice. And thirdly, how under your context, you don't account for the status for the harms that occur when you don't practice proactive policing, right? The concessions the important concessions that we make and points of clarity. First of all, we tell you that it's fine for us to mitigate your sentence based on whether entrapment was used. But what we don't support is complete absolvement. Because under the status quo, there are instances where people commit crimes because of compelling reasons such as desperate circumstances. We still don't absolve you of the crime. We make your sentence lighter. Under our policy, that's congruent with the criminal principle that already exists, right? All we're saying is that now, instead of like mitigating the sentence because of your circumstances, we're mitigating it because although you acted in your own agency, we facilitate the crime. The underlying principle is, given the same context where the police officer didn't intervene, you are likely you would have participated in that same socially deviant behavior which harms others, right? So, two questions. First of all, is this legitimate as a practice? Well, we told you that contextually there are communities that need this, but secondly, you're able to meet your burden as the state of ensuring social compliance, and thirdly, you protect the largest number of people. Even if there are adverse harms for the person who committed the crime because we facilitated, they're not the actor we value in today's debate. We don't value the deviant youth that's selling like crack in the Bronx. We value the struggling black mother whose duty to survive the Bronx is made even harder by the fact that you directly denigrate the sort of quality of life that's available in those black communities. We don't like the idea that you're characterizing black folks as deviant. What you need to be honest about is the fact that the sort of deviant behavior that entrapment catches are the sort of people that make your condition in those communities even more desperate as a black person. Account for the sort of mothers who deal with like gangsters, and account for the sort of mothers who have to deal with drug dealers. You want to protect and shield those youths under your context. We say if we catch you doing it, you're creating an even more difficult context to survive. So we prioritize the majority over the minority, right? Also, what we get from William is the idea that it's legitimate and it gives you a context that establishes necessity. But secondly, how it ensures social compliance. I'm going to be talking about how if you don't use entrapment, you facilitate complicity in policing, you facilitate a cop-out that allows the police to use the sort of barriers to investigation to opt out of doing the work, right? If you enable them further, you're able to hold police accountable and demand outcomes because you facilitated the concept of policing, right? So what we get is that racial profiling is bad and that you get violent reactions towards black youth. First of all, if you have entrenchment as a recognized policing practice, you're able to regulate it. We feel like in instances where, for example, you can't tell me that a police acting aggressively towards a black youth is a normal thing. That's police brutality. And currently we have mechanisms to monitor your police. We make you wear body cams. Why can't we then use body cams to monitor if you're proportionately trapping people, right? Or whether you're focusing on black youth. There are ways to regulate it. But if you can only regulate something insofar as you recognize it. Under fees must fall, I think that's a really cute example, right? Because if a police officer provokes you and Ndlovu reacts a certain way, you must ask yourself why other student leaders don't react in a certain way, why other student leaders maintain their principal high ground, especially because they understand that police officers can manipulate narratives and denigrate a movement. Ask yourself why certain leaders respond differently. It's because as much as someone can create and facilitate a context, how you respond is up to your personal agency. So compare Shaira Kala to Ndlovu, right? This is problematic. Also, this idea of okay, compare Ndlovu to other non-violent black protesters, right, who don't have class privilege. It depends on your own personal agency. Whether or not violence is right is out of the question. What we're talking about is the fact that if you act in a certain way, you must be held accountable. Also, they tell us about the fact that in underdeveloped communities, you're often catching youth, for example, who buy drugs. We like this, actually. We like the idea of a police officer catching you as a black youth at 16 buying drugs from the Bronx. Because we put you in the juvenile system, we reform you. Conversely, we don't enter the community, you continue participating in drug trade, and we catch you when you're 22. Then you're going straight to jail, right? You've managed to characterize how these communities are inaccessible to police, so there's no community development that can happen. If we have to catch youth, then rather we catch them through entrapment, but we can save them and salvage them from being caught later on in life and being thrust into a police system that is unfriendly towards black bodies. Also, they tell us about a no-snitching policy. This is exactly why there's barriers to investigation in these communities. If the community won't comply, you're forced to go a step further. The alternative is you just don't police them in the Bronx because there's so many barriers. We'd rather you employ this mechanism to overcome the barrier of the fact that there's a lack of community participation. Because what is the alternative, right? Also, we're going to tell you how not employing this policy incentivizes a cop out of the police's part. I'll take closing.
Well, you premise the entire idea that they're likely to get caught anyway. Then we ask the question, why do you need to bait them? Why do you need to fish them out when you just catch them?
Here's why we need to bait them. One of the biggest barriers to policing is the fact that you as the police don't have the privilege of knowing the location and time when a crime is going to take place. That's the reason you don't catch criminals. However, by looking at community patterns, you are able to gauge the fact that, look, drug trade does happen. What you don't know is the specifics, so you don't catch you specifically doing. All we do is we bridge that barrier by saying, just stand there, create the time, create the place that you know, and the criminals will come to you. It's not like you're forcing them. You're creating you're facilitating the crime. But what is fundamentally important is the fact that the action is carried out by those people, right? Also, complacency as far as cop-outs. So police are understaffed and they're under-resourced. This leads to two things. Cases either go cold because there's so many barriers to investigation that you just can't solve them. But secondly, it means that police officers can only account for the aftermath of crime, right? They can only solve your murder after you've been trafficked. They can only intervene when there's been an overdose, right? We prioritize the idea of proactive policing, where you can no longer use the lack of community participation or the lack of information or the difficulty in engaging with the community as a cop-out. We've enabled you now. We've said that although you don't have community participation, although you can't determine when a crime is going to take place, we've allowed you the privilege of creating the crime, and you can then be held accountable to policing, right? As long as you don't seek to empower authorities, as long as you don't seek to accentuate policing, you always allow for a cop-out. Police officers can get lazy and complacent because they can always use these very problems that you identify as a cop-out, right? Under our policy, you still have comprehensive investigation coupled now with a new policing tactic. For the sake of principal legitimacy, for the sake of protecting the most vulnerable members, and for the sake of upholding the principle of mitigation, not complete absolvement, which leads to an attitude of social compliance, we're very, very proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for concluding the case for the open government, and now call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the case conclude the first half.
By pandering to broken window theory and trickle-down theory, we've already excluded opening from this today's debate, because we tell you that not only are these theories principally problematic, but from many examples we can show you that they just don't work. Yes. And today's debate, I'm going to be dealing specifically with why, when we look back at not only what really works in communities, but what the culture of policing specifically does to make crime best fought, that we can never submit to the policies of government in today's debate. So today I'm going to be focusing specifically on how do we best catch criminals in my rebuttal. And I feel like this is really important in today's debate because it's not about quantity. We learned that from Giuliani's mistakes. When we focus on quantity, we don't get the best results. But I'm going to be analyzing this very specifically in today's debate. So firstly, we need to understand that this action itself isn't completely free from being completely legitimate. They said no, people who tend towards crime will commit this crime and will catch them in the act which they would have done anyway, right? Besides answer to the POI that you got already from closing, we tell you in today's debate that the reason that if this was to happen in the status quo, if man A was tempting man B with drugs, man A would probably also go to jail if he wasn't a cop, right?
Yes.
It's because he's tempting and coercing the individual, not because he has drug in his pocket, but because it's a tempt and coercive event. We tell you that that's just not legitimate in today's debate when we focus on specifically the nature of policing as a means to reform and to put away the people who need to be put away, rather than taking them out of the place in which they are and moving them into a space in which they create and in which they want to commit crime. That's what makes it principally illegitimate in the first place. You didn't engage with that analysis specifically. But more importantly, we tell you in today's debate that if we want to end crime, it's never going to be effective if we lock away all the teenage boys who want to get pot, right? For two reasons. One, if we compare, like if we went into the white community with people with lots of money, who are really privileged, and say we're going to sell you marijuana, they'd say, cool, how much is it, right? If you go into the black community getting a similar response and locking you away, it's principally unfair, saying that they're the reason that all the crime problems exist. We can see this already just disparaging because the white boys don't have crime in their community, the black boys do. Why? And this is principally because of the bosses and kingpins who control and create crime and disorder in the community. We all agree on this, right? How do we catch them, right? How do we catch individuals with lots of cash they can use, the ability to maneuver and change and evolve? We don't go and hit all their customers because it's not going to ever work. They'll move and evolve and change and develop and become different, right? What do, right? More importantly, we target them specifically, and entrapment just doesn't do that, right? Entrapment is very specifically targeted at the individuals we can catch on the street. You can't entrap a drug lord in his four-story apartment living in the suburbs, right? You're just using entrapment. That's not how it works in today's debate, right? We need to understand in today's debate that entrapment is very specifically targeted, especially the way they characterize it, in communities and individuals who are vulnerable. Individuals who are unlikely to have responded in the way they did unless they're actually tempted with the options they give them in today's debate. Broken window theory fails because all you do is take these individuals who want casual marijuana, throw them into the prison system and say, we're going to reform you from your problematic scenarios. Problems that your community is still going to have when you go back. Problems you're likely to exacerbate because you've met actual hardened criminals who stabbed their mothers, right, in juvenile prison. You're less likely to be a beneficial member of the community, right? So we tell you in today's debate that allowing policemen to fish for young black people in communities is just actually harmful in today's debate. The outcomes don't help. But even if all the best scenarios were taken, we're not going to entrap the big fish. We're going to just take their potentially violent consumers and not actually solve the crime problems in their community. So we tell you we don't solve the problem in their case. So today I'm going to be dealing with one main issue, and that's dealing with the idea about the erosion of law enforcement. Before I deal with that, opening.
Do the comparative. Is it worse for a black youth to be caught at 22 and given a disproportionately high sentence to society's deterrent for crime, or to be caught at 16 and trapped, sentenced to 6 months community service in which we can use the information from him to prevent crime in the future?
But that's like not how it works, right? Like, let's go and specifically look at how the systems have actually worked, right? Often you end up with a community of like no fathers, you're not able to help with their children. You have children who miss like 3 or 4 years of school and are likely to go back into the system, right? Yeah. You're not creating a culture of people being involved in their community because they feel like being rebellious for 1 year in their life, but instead just tell them, don't reform, go back to a community in which we offer drugs every day. Like, it's just not a cycle of, you never told us where that they're going to be saved from the problems in the community in the first place. Please give some clarity on that, right? So in terms of the erosion of law enforcement, and here I'm going to talk specifically about how having a culture of buying and having a good relationship with the police is really important in fighting crime. So here we're going to look at a lot of comparatives, and specifically we look at lots of white communities where we don't have crime being as prevalent, especially targeting youth. There's one thing that's really important. It's a large trust in the police force, right? If you look at the ability that when something goes wrong in the house, many white mothers on television phone the police, is the ability to believe that you can buy into a law enforcement system that actually helps you, right? That doesn't happen in communities that believe they're constantly being targeted, units, even if you look in South Africa, more and more white families don't even do that because they see it as a means to bribe to get out of a fine, right? Police and law enforcement, when you're not seen as somebody who isn't there to trap you with a fine, to trap you with another means to put you in jail, are less likely to people you can collaborate with, less people you think as people who protect you, but more people who are there to try and find a loophole to put you away, right? And that's really problematic because it means that you don't allow law enforcement in these communities. There are many communities that don't even let police in because it's dangerous for them to be there. How do we regulate and prevent people from being in spaces where they can be offered drugs if a policeman's never going to drive down that road, right? So we tell you in today's debate that more crime fighting doesn't mean more buying from the communities, but more importantly, more buying from the communities almost always means more crime fighting, because when you can work together, the mother's more likely to phone the police when a child goes missing, rather than just waiting for them to come back and in that regard. So we tell you that people are safer when they buy into the police system. They're more likely to get involved and do other things. It's not about how many people you put in jail. Because if you put in jail my son and my uncle and my brother, I'm not going to feel any safer. But if you're in my streets, I believe that you're not coming to trap me, but you're there to help me, I'm more likely to go to you for help. That's when law enforcement can be the most impactful. When it's not locking away people on low-level crimes, not looking for them to try and get them to put them away, but rather trying to help the communities to be better. So we tell in today's debate that the urgency doesn't lie in crime itself, but it lies in this new problem with distrust in the police that means that nobody ever uses them as a mechanism of monopoly on violence. But secondly, the legitimacy specifically lies in good police work. That's a lot of analysis didn't recognize about the connection between putting people away and imprisoning them. But finally, when are we most effective? We're most effective when we look for the kingpins, when we don't look for people to entrap, but we rather go looking for the people who are trapping the kids in the first place. And that's what the motion should absolutely like.
Right, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for concluding the first half of the debate. Now, kindly do not bang on the tables while speakers are speaking. Sure, anyone in front wants us to hear them to the best of our abilities. Thank you.
Aside closing government, we want to take you away from the world of dreaming and to the world of reality. We want to tell you how we help the very act that opening opposition is concerned about, the black teenager, the community, and how this creates more faith in the criminal justice system. I've got a few things I'm going to extend on, but you'll realize exactly what it is. First, this is what you got from opening opposition. And here there are 4 arguments, or rather 5, that we're going to integrate in terms of our case. Those are going to be direct responses. Racial profiling and the harm to black teenagers, engagement with the community, and faith in police's ability to do good work. The legitimacy of making actors commit crimes, small fish being caught, and how black teenagers are the ones that are being caught by entrapment, and the fact that you make people scared of police and not trust the police. You'll see all of that engagement in terms of our case. But one thing I'm going to engage with directly is the idea that you discourage investigation. We'd argue the opposite. We think entrapment only happens after reasonable investigation. We get a bit more of that analysis in my positive manner. Firstly, right, we think it's not that we're it's not that we're shafting opening government. We just think that it's really important that we move into a world of actual reality. Because this isn't only a policy that's applied by Rudy Giuliani, it's also applied in countries like Japan. And we're more likely to appeal to those kind of existing models. Not like we're disagreeing with the model that they bring you, but let's just be realistic. Let's just be realistic about models that exist in the real world, because that's the debate we're meant to have. And you can't force a closing government to buy into a shitty policy. We don't think that's okay. Let's look at the act that entrapment really goes after. Because entrapment's not about black teenagers. It's not about drugs and who's consuming them. Entrapment is only about the kingpins. Entrapment is only about the boss leaders. That's the only people that we entrap in Japan. And that's the kind of model that we want to investigate in today's debate. It's not like we're shafting. We just think that that's important for today's debate. Okay, so let's look at the act. We think that the people that the police are relatively certain are committing crimes are people that the police go after. But 2 conditions. 1, the police are certain that they aren't able to catch these people on the status quo. And secondly, the police are certain that these people are powerful. So these are people like drug lords, powerful corporates, politicians, and cartel bosses. No, thank you. We think in status quo, entrapment is already used illegally by police officers, but to these targets only, and then these police officers get prosecuted or whatever. We think in status quo, entrapment is never for the black teenager. Entrapment is never used for the small fish. In status quo, the only time a police officer goes out of their way to use entrapment, even though illegally, is is when they're going after big people like Al Pacino and so forth, when this happens all the time. We don't think that's the reality of today's debate. We think that's important. Right, here's the extension. We think we just cannot catch these people. Why? We think that less powerful people take the fall for them, the very actors that they want to protect in today's debate. Why do less powerful people take the fall? Firstly, they're easier to catch, like you got. Secondly, we think it's easy for them to be framed by the powerful people. And three, we think it's very difficult to obtain valuable testimony from these people because they don't know anything. We think that's particularly important, and that's why they're the ones that get caught in today's debate. Why are the harms here? The first harm is that you fill prison systems with exploited victims who are used by these big, powerful people. How do we solve that? By catching the powerful person, it means you have less ability to exploit young actors. No, thank you. Secondly, we think that the second harm here is that you create a cycle of innocent people going to prison because they're exploited, then being replaced by other members of the community, and the cycle of false victims has no organic end to it. So it becomes a continuous cycle of false victims being put in prison. We think we solve that by intervening on this circle of harm and actually doing something to the kingpin behind prison. The third harm that you create is that true justice is never pursued because powerful people aren't trialed or the trials aren't successful, and further investigation itself is prevented. We think when you catch a small person on the ground, because you can no longer pursue that particular crime because someone's already taken the fall from it. So you prevent investigation by not entrapping because you must give someone the verdict. And when you give someone the verdict, you prevent pursuing someone else to get that verdict. So you don't get that kind of investigation. But moreover, how do we solve this? We solve this by giving a trial literal investigation. But moreover, culpability does still exist because we know these people are drug lords. You yourselves concede that these people are culpable in your own speech, so you should have no problem with putting them behind prison. I think that's really important. No, thank you, yes. Then we think that another harm that you create when you don't investigate entrapment, and something happens in status quo. The police already have the incentive to vigorously pursue these individuals. Some police officers make it their entire life goal to catch one big drug lord because they care about that community. We think these people are going to, in status quo, pursue entrapment in any instance. Why is this a bad thing? Firstly, because then you must prosecute that police officer under current law. So you should take police officers off the streets and give them some kind of punishment because they pursued entrapment. But secondly, you allow the other individuals, and not just police officers, are also more likely to want to create justice for themselves. You allow them, thank you, the continuation of mob justice, where community takes justice into its own hands because no one is doing it for them. I think that's important. Why? Firstly, because now you must prosecute these mobs of people that are taking justice into their own hands. But secondly, we think that these people who pursue mob justice commit crimes that they otherwise wouldn't have committed. When you're a mother and your son was killed by a drug lord, you're more likely to want to take the verdict into your own hands and commit a crime in order to get justice for your son. You must then put that mother behind prison because they don't have the power to buy out the ability to not get a trial. Yes?
Sure. There's no easier way to trample on human rights than letting policemen with guns go rogue and act on their own initiative.
No, we aren't conceding. In fact, we don't let them go rogue by creating this policy. They only go rogue because the policy doesn't exist. I think that's really important. The reason why they act illegally is because there's no policy or mechanism for them to catch people. We create less rogue police officers through this policy. That's important. But three, our final harm is that you prevent the cause of justice. You make it more difficult to prosecute that specific crime. And two, we think that investigation is usually discontinued. I already told you that. When has this happened in South Africa, for example? When Thabo Mbeki intervened in the case of Jacob Zuma's criminal charges, that case was thrown out of court and you never saw the continuation of that trial in true justice. If entrapment exists, we make it more easier for us to catch these corrupt politicians. Remember, these people have a lot of power for them to get out. No, thank you. Next thing that we're going to extend on is how do you improve a trial? A lot of the time, these people do go into court and get a trial. What happens here is that we try and base catching them in prison off the testimony of witnesses and victims. Why doesn't this happen? Because of their power that these powerful people have, they incentivize people to no longer testify. Either they pay the people off, or they threaten them with things, and that prevents them from testifying against these individuals, which means they're already in court. You then implement entrapment to create evidence, and then you can sure putting them behind jails. We think you improve court systems, and you improve trials in that regard. Where are the harms of not improving trials? Community loses faith in the criminal justice system when a powerful mob boss has gone to court and comes out clean. We think they lose faith. Secondly, the community is more likely to take action into their own hands when the court can't even trial a powerful person. And three, we think that this community will now fear this powerful person because they're even able to overcome court systems. But four, we think they live in constant fear. That's important. Next point of extension, deterrence. We think that you create deterrence when there's a greater risk of being caught. How do we create deterrence in today's case? Firstly, we eliminate the perceived separation between themselves and the crime, because now they're actively doing it. Secondly, we decrease dependence on testimony, and therefore we decrease the kind of power they have. And three, we create a fear of committing these crimes. Why is this important and how this creates a cycle of organic change where less people commit crimes because deterrence actually works? We think that's particularly important. Last up, we think in terms of smaller fish. You can now absolve these smaller fish because we can prove that there's a bigger fish that's actually committing crimes. So we can get these teenagers out of jail by showing there's a bigger person who's actually committing these crimes. We think this is important. This happens in Japan. There are real-world applications. We don't have to appeal to their Rudy Giuliani policy. We don't like that, but we like what happens in Japan. And thank you.
Right, thank you. Like, I know you all aren't in this final, so it's easy to forget that there's a final happening. But kindly sit down if you want to be here.
Firstly, it's absolutely unclear, this is very disappointing when closing government, how you can trap a kingpin into selling you weed. You're precisely a drug lord because you are not on the ground, right? And then Tshiamo spends his entire case telling you about the people who usually sell those drugs are useless, they have no information, they're just peons. But you're going to put them in jail nonetheless. So, massive problem, solution gap. Oh my god, you don't even have a case in today's debate, and you tried a shaft, right? So it's like a double screw over. But then there comes a problem, right, from opening government. Opening government gives you examples of entrapment, and then they try and justify this in terms of moral culpability. Who's at fault here? The police who allowed drug sellers to openly go about their business, which created the market in the first place, or was it a policing policy that said we should then go after that created market, right? The problem is that market only exists through your laziness, because the more times you try and entrap the general public, the more police officers you have deployed, the more investigation you do about the smaller nyana criminals, the less investigation you can do about their drug lords, about their CIA handlers, or wherever you're selling crack into black neighborhoods, although we know it comes from very high up, and usually they go underground when you use policies of entrapment, right? I'm extending on what Maxine said. The problem with entrapment becomes you don't get any viable information. You end up deploying a policing policy that ends up filling jails with useless criminals that then get a proper education about how to gang rape, how to manufacture crack cocaine, and then how to sell to the whites in the white neighborhoods like Melito and Mount Edgecombe. Your problem is that you talked about constructive forms of punishment, like paying fines in community service, and then Mpilo exclusively talked about sending kids to juvenile, right? There's a big problem of what punishment you're talking about. Because your punishment must be a deterrence, right? If you're not sending them to jail or juvenile, where you're scared of the gangs, right? And then they indoctrinate you into a cycle of violence, you can easily pay a fine and then be out. But equally the problem, look at Fees Must Fall, right? Where you saw the provocation. They didn't force you to pay fines, they frustrated you by sending you to court over and over and over again. Because the problem with entrapment is you end up not having a proper evidentiary burden, right? It's very difficult to prove that someone was buying into your policy of selling drugs aside from hearsay, right? You then need to document the evidence. And the shoddy policing of the metro usually means that they'd rather accept a bribe, right? Because they're out in the field anyway. These are your smaller nyana metro SAPS officers who want sense in the ability to protect the community, right? Why do you even trust them to go after small fish? They might as well frisk their pockets and say, well, you made 200, if you give it to me, I'll go away, right? There's a massive problem-solution gap in today's debate. First point of extension. We need priority policing in South Africa, and we need it now. So to the extent that you allow drugs to be openly sold, and then only target those who are buying, you are deploying your police officers not for the low-hanging fruit, but for the precise consequences of your failure to police properly. We don't want to catch individuals whose criminal intention is like opportunistic or innocent, We want the guy who forced his family to live in a crack cocaine environment and create a market of children, Tshiamo. You are like, no, these guys can be let go because they're small fish. If you are selling drugs to kids, are you really deserving of being let out? Are you really deserving of being absolved of creating a criminal environment, right? The problem is once you catch them, you have to send them to prison, right? That's the only deterrent. But then they learn from gangs. They expand their markets. They network. They network and they learn how to commit crimes on the real, right? So that's the problem. It's about priority policing. Why is this mutually exclusive? Because we have a shortage of police officers. We have a shortage of detectives. We have a shortage of metro resources, right? That's why we didn't send FMF people to jail. That's why we had to frustrate them with going to court. So you can't complete your investigations. Mpilo acted like investigative work in South Africa is fine. Oh my word, do you even live here? Do you even go here? It's terrible. So what you're going to do is deploy a lot of resources, not into low-hanging fruit, but into innocuous criminals. Criminals that only exist because you didn't go after those who are creating the criminal environment, right? Neighborhoods don't become unsafe of people willing to buy drugs. They become unsafe for the people who are selling. And then Tshiamo's version of entrapment doesn't work because entrapment is catching someone unlikely to commit a crime. How are you unlikely to commit a crime if you are selling drugs, right? That's why entrapment doesn't work the other way. That's called a drug bust, right? And we have those mechanisms already in place. Take a hard fought the gov bench, right? So it's about filling jail spaces as well. You have to send them to prison, but you don't have enough jail spaces, right? That's why we're getting rid of bestiality and sex with corpses, necrophilia. Because not only are you wasting court time, we're murderers and rapists, and this happens a lot, right? We have hundreds of thousands of them coming into court per year. We don't have the time to be dealing with small Nyana Joe or John who wanted to buy a banky of marijuana. That's a problem. You deplete the resource base and make policing ineffective but inimical to the public and not the true criminals, right? It's a diversion. Secondly, who do you police? And then we're mooting this question of like blackness, black, what. But the problem is the following. The black community is more likely to buy those drugs, right? So it becomes an example of where the criminal racket going on in black neighborhoods is the fault of corrupt metro officers who don't want to prosecute the crack cartels, the weed cartels, because they get bribed anyway. That's still a flaw under your model. The comparator in today's debate is that instead of sending all the policemen out to entrap the public, you go directly after those sellers, right? Even if you don't catch the kingpin, you become visible policers and you decrease the access to drugs in those communities. You get the people carrying knives, carrying guns, and selling munga to the hundreds of people I pass on my way getting to Wits, lying underneath bridges. You decrease their access to that market. So there are fewer black kids in jail because they were using drugs and more drug sellers in jail. There's a comparison in terms of resource efficacy. Sasasa will tell you more. But also, in terms of criminality of demographics, right? Why is there an extension in our debate about what happens when you target the public? Because if you are sending them to court, right, especially, like they did with FMF, you become inimical towards the police itself and the criminal justice system. You lose your faith in it because you're like, why am I here when the policeman that shot Shaira Kala got away, right? It has nothing to do with provocation, but it's when you police and actively over-police small-time criminals who are recipients of criminal activity and not the creators of unsafe criminal environments, you end up tying them in court, right? What does it do to black communities who are the low-hanging fruit who are going to be buying these drugs and the entrapped ones in the first place? It puts them in an adversarial process against judges, against the CJS. They begin to mistrust the police as well. The extension becomes, you become more habitually exposed to instances where you are treated like a criminal, so you rather side with the criminals and the drug sellers because you are frustrated by the amount of times you've been going to court and your process has been frustrated. Tshiamo talked about like more evidence being created by entrapment. That's just not true, Tshiamo. I don't know what reality you live in. When you introduce entrapment, the burden becomes harder because now you need to prove how your evil intention wasn't the only reason the crime was committed.
Right, we thank the member of opposition for starting closing the opposition's case, and now call on the government whip to conclude the debate for the government bench.
Madam Speaker, the people are sick and tired of criminals getting away with the crimes they commit. They're sick and tired of criminals terrorizing the very same neighborhoods they live in, Madam Speaker. And this debate at its crux is about whether or not it's legitimate, principally, and it's beneficial to allow police to use entrapment as a legitimate tool in fighting crime, Madam Speaker. We got no engagement on how we should fight crime from anyone on the opposition's bench. We think that their harms exist under current status quo, where entrapment is illegal, Madam Speaker. So all their harms exist in the world they were advocating for currently. A couple of things we need to clear up first of all, Madam Speaker, and it's this idea of a shot, right? We tell you that William in his speech tells you that this is a last resort, right? You're not removing investigations, you're not removing stakeouts, and you're not removing current investigation tools. Tshiamo tells you that same thing, Madam Speaker. He tells you that we're not going away with current investigations, we're just adding a certain level of, another level of tools to provide for them to fight, right? They don't engage with this. But moreover, let's deal with a couple of things they told us in today's debate. The first, then the major thing that came up in opening government was this idea of racial profiling. 3 responses. First, they need to show us why it's intrinsically linked to entrapment, right, Madam Speaker? So they need to show us that it's impossible for entrapment to occur without racial profiling. They didn't do this, so we think that it can occur without racial profiling. It's not an inherent characteristic. But moreover, we tell you that they concede to the fact that the majority of crimes happen in the poorest of neighborhoods. And the poorest of neighborhoods happen to be black, Madam Speaker. So we think that even if racial profiling is a thing, we think that it's a legitimate thing, simply because that's where the majority of the crimes are bound to happen, Madam Speaker. So logic says the police should be where the majority of crimes are bound to happen. But thirdly, we tell you that idea of racial profiling, we tell you that people are more upset about gangsters getting away with crime than they are about racial profiling. They're more upset with police not doing enough to fight crime in the neighborhood than they are about racial profiling, Madam Speaker. And they need to speak to that. So because this racial profiling isn't an intrinsic part of this, right, Madam Speaker, so it can principally occur without this racial profiling, we think that this idea falls flat on its face. But moreover, let's deal with this idea of this engagement with community, right? Because this was a huge thing that ran across the government bench. Because so first of all, why is it mutually exclusive to engage with the community, but to fight crime as well, Madam Speaker? We think it's okay for you to have stakeouts, it's okay for you to entrap people, and still engage with the community, right, Madam Speaker? We think that the people you engage with the community, sit down, sir, with the community, are people who are most likely not going to commit the crime anyway, Madam Speaker. So these are the grandmothers, the people who are sick and tired of the criminals, right? These are the people we're engaging with, so you don't remove this engagement. But secondly, moreover, we tell you that the engagement doesn't occur under current status quo because people don't see the police as doing enough to fight crime in their neighborhoods, Madam Speaker. The reason black people don't trust the police in their neighborhood is because they don't see them doing enough to fight crime in their neighborhood. We're enabling them to have a mechanism of doing more to fight crime in that neighborhood. So this perception changes, right, Madam Speaker? Sit down, sir. So we think that when the police start using entrapment and they catch these big fish, the perception will change, right, Madam Speaker? People will realize that the police are doing more to fight crime in their neighborhood. So this has a couple of effects. And the most important effect it has is it changes the perception black people have with police, right, Madam Speaker? So they see that the police actually care and are doing more. So there's this engagement you get, right, Madam Speaker? Under current status quo, we don't have that engagement, and they don't show us how they improve that engagement on their side. But moreover, let's then deal with this idea of community trust, right? We tell that the community distrust with police occurs from a young age, when young men or young boys are taught by gangsters and drug lords and all these criminals that they shouldn't trust police, Madam Speaker, because the police are pigs, right, Madam Speaker? We think that you remove this distrust when you get away and you arrest these people who perpetrate these sort of messages, right, Madam Speaker? For moreover, we tell you that the distrust occurs when these gangsters, no thank you, sir, I'll take you at 5, run roughshod, and they incite fear into people's minds so that people have to opt into these gangs, Madam Speaker, for protection, right, Madam Speaker? So you have to opt into these gangs. But when you remove these gangsters through entrapment, Madam Speaker, and it might not work for everyone, but it might work for 5, and we tell you that even if it works for 5 people, then it's beneficial, right, Madam Speaker? And they need to show us why that's not the case. Sit down. So we tell you that we create trust when the police do their job, and when the police, furthermore, remove the gangsters who impart this message that they should distrust police. No, thank you, I said at 5, right, Madam Speaker. But then let's deal with this idea that they brought up of you can't trap the bigger fishes. We tell you a couple of responses. The first, we tell you that Al Capone was caught, not because Al Capone himself was caught, but because his accountant was caught, and his accountant then turned into a state witness, Madam Speaker. So we tell you that these smaller fishes have the ability to give us the ability to catch these bigger fishes, Madam Speaker, and that's something they don't deal with. But moreover, we tell you that we'd rather catch smaller fishes than catch no fishes, Madam Speaker. And 2 reasons why we'd rather catch smaller fishes than no fishes. No, thank you, sit down, both of you. We tell you that the first reason we'd rather catch smaller fishes is one, it changes the perception. So people realize that the police are doing more to fight crime in their neighborhood. But secondly, Madam Speaker, it creates a level of safety, right? We think that even if we take them off the street momentarily, that momentarily of peace they have is fundamentally more beneficial than them having no moment of peace. I'll take Waris.
So you send them to jail, all of these small fish, and they graduate into bigger fish. First thing. Second
Sit
thing.
down, don't allow one comment. We tell you one, if you want to reform the jail system, that's fine, Madam Speaker. We tell you that we arrest people even though we know that the jail system isn't ideal, right, Madam Speaker? We want to take them off the streets in the first place. If you want to reform how we rehabilitate people, that's fine, but that's not within the scope of this debate, right? But so moreover, sit down, thank you. But moreover, we tell you that we can use these bigger fishes, the smaller fishes, to catch the bigger fishes, but the perception is also good. But let's deal with this idea of who do we prioritize? And this was largely opposition's extension, closing opposition's extension. So Waris tells you we should prioritize drug dealers and not the people who buy it. We say that's good. We can prioritize and entrap those drug dealers, Madam Speaker. We don't have to necessarily be exempt, right? We tell you that these are the people we'll target in any way, Madam Speaker. So we'll try to entrap these people, right? So, but furthermore, he tells you then, so that's mostly what they told you. So let's look at what we told you, right? We told you in our speech how you fundamentally crack down on organized crime and how status quo, when you look at Japan, this system has worked. My partner gave you analysis as to how Japan has one of the lowest crime rates, despite empirically doing this. But moreover, we told you that current status quo, there's certain barriers that prevent police from actively engaging in proper investigations. The no snitching they spoke about, Madam Speaker, the police not being allowed in communities. Those very things are the reasons police have to resort to these measures, Madam Speaker. And that's analysis that you got from my partner, and that's analysis that went widely unrebutted. And we were very disappointed that Waris didn't engage with them on any level. And for these reasons, we think that COG gets the first. Thank you very much.
Already, we thank the government whip, and now call on the opposition whip to conclude the debate. Yeah.
Against debates, they've missed the most obvious question. Why do we fight crime and for who? So we tell you that on the way up, why would you fight crime when you not only criminalize an entire population, not only when you create community paranoia, but you also stick them in a juvenile system that makes sure that they perpetuate that crime system and a cycle of poverty, right? We tell you that, like, on the comparative, in the status quo, we tell you that it's perfectly fine because we don't believe that it should be intrusive, we don't believe that, like, justice should discriminate, and we've told you largely, even in opening, like, we'll give them some credits just to make sure they don't get fought, right? But, like, we tell you that fundamentally, like, we think that in terms of, like, the idea of engagements and specifically these people having a color, these people being assisted class, we tell you that they've not actually understood that sort of analysis, right? So we tell you that, like, a lot of opening has told us about dreams, but we tell you that fundamentally today's debate is about reality. And that's what I'm going to tell you in my word speech, where I'll be asking the question, A, is it effective? And B, is it going to actually help improve the criminal justice system, right? So before that, we tell you that, like, Waris gave a really good analysis in terms of the context, right? So we tell you that, like, we don't like the idea of this motion because in the context of the three-strike rule of Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, they made sure that, like, 1 in 3 black men are in prison. Yes. So like, you can't function in that sense. When you also talk about the criminalization of marijuana, they made sure that 1 in 3 black men are in prison. That's problematic. Also, the third idea is that we also have police resentment and, like, the idea of why we have riots in Ferguson. They haven't engaged with that sort of analysis. They tell us that, like, no, we're going to trust the police more. That's absolute rubbish. The fact that, like, the police became more intrusive and over-police is the reason why we have riots in Ferguson in the first place, right? So we don't buy the analysis that somehow we're going to love the police more just because they're around us all the time, right? But, like, the last thing is that fundamentally we think that Tshiamo caught a healthy fault because, like, Japan doesn't have a black problem, right? You tell you, like, fundamentally, like, it's just analysis. Thanks for coming, right? So, like, let's look at this idea of, like, how effective it is, right? So, like, opening comes up and they're like, yo, we're going to have some regulations. 2 problems here. One, these are the same people who are shooting black people in the streets, the same people who shot Trayvon Martin. We don't think that they should be fighting for some sort of, like, moral high ground, right? Thanks for coming. Waris also told you that these people are also the people who perpetuate corruption and are willing to let you go for a ticket fine if you pay them 100 rand, right? That's why the normalized joke is that the speeding limits in South Africa is 100 rand, right? We tell you that like that's the inherent corruption in the police system. They haven't dealt with the character analysis there, right? So we also find it problematic that like Tshiamo spoke to us about like baiting and Zoom, and no thank you, we're not putting you back in this debate, thanks, right? So like the idea that like Zuma was baited was exactly the same problem that we're talking about here, right? Because the fact that like we can use politics to bait people is the problem that we have here. Because we say that politics would inform the fact that we're persecuting black people, exactly, right? So we're saying in the same way that Thabo Mbeki persecuted Zuma specifically and baited him, is the same reason why like political instruments, the police can be used as a political instruments to incarcerate black people and make sure that like the privatization of like the criminal justice system perpetuates and makes more money, right? Tell you that's a fundamental problem. Thanks for coming. No thanks. Cool. So like opening did a great job. We'll take them along, but I want to extend in terms of rebuttal. They've talked about the idea that like this is specifically about black people, but I want to tell you about the context in which that surrounds us, right? So like we don't buy the analysis that these people will be reincorporated into society. For what reasons, right? First of all, tell you like they are victims of institutionalized like injustice, right? And not only that, the idea that like that same system keeps you there and makes sure that like you're part of the juvenile system. We don't get the buy-in that you're talking about. We also don't think that like you're making sure that like crime is prevented in the first place. I would go back to my original question that I said in my intro. Who are we policing for? What is this debate about? If we're denigrating the dignity of black people, right? So like we also think that like in terms of like the analysis that opening gave you is quite shallow, right? So we tell you for 3 reasons this is why we think that like black people won't engage with the police system and won't prevent crime, right? One, we tell you about the placebo effects, right? When you tell black people that they're prone to criminality and then you make sure that that reality becomes true because you're actively pursuing them because of this motion, you perpetuate that idea, right? Second of all, you also perpetuate the idea of escapism that leads to marijuana usage, that leads to crack cocaine usage, because there's nothing more pertinent to a person like, or turns you to drug use than finding out that like your brother, your father, and your support system are all in prison, right? There's a sense of hopelessness there. They haven't engaged with the idea of institutionalized violence. Thanks for coming, okay? So like the second reason is the destabilization of nuclear families, right? So we tell you that like because of that, that perpetuates the crime family, right? So we don't think that every single black person in America has the ability to go to Harvard because they don't have the same sort of social networks to attain Harvard or even have the ability to be part of that system, right? I'm an exception, great, but we don't think that that's the norm, okay? So the idea that we also think that like OG has come a healthy forth as well, is because we tell you that like the fact that like they give them a lighter sentence is the problem here. You say then you're not preventing crime, you're subverting your own motion because you'll get out and commit the same crime again and again, right? So we tell you that like fundamentally these are all the reasons why we think that like the idea of blackface, or black people being persecuted is pertinent in today's debate and why we should take first. Closing.
We catch a drug lord by letting them commit a non-drug related crime. Japan, please engage.
Yo, fam, I told you, I'll tell you again, Japan doesn't have a black problem. 2, right, the idea that like you're a drug lord means that you have a whole class of people that are under you to take the bait for you. The same reason why like people in the TRC got away with like the big fish in the TRC got away is because like they could literally pass the buck to other people, right? So like we don't think that like you'd be baiting for people at the top, you'd be baiting normally for the low-hanging fruits. Please engage with that analysis, right? No, thank you, right? So we tell you that fundamentally we don't think that you're culpable when you're actively being coerced, not only by the institutional violence in the system, but by the police and the mechanism that exists in, right? So let's look at the idea of like the axis that we're dealing with, where I'll be telling you like another reason why it's largely ineffective, right? So I'll tell you that like we haven't actually understood in today's debate who the actor is here. Where like I already talked about corruption, I've already talked about like the idea of normalized or politicization of the police, but this is particularly about the individual police here. So we tell you that the police officer didn't sign up to the military because they didn't want to give up their personal life here. We tell you that these police women and men still have to interact with the community on the ground, which is problematic because A, snitches really do get stitches, especially if you're a cop, right? Second of all, we don't think that they consented to the idea of like putting their lives in danger, putting their personal life in danger, right? So we tell you that like fundamentally that's problematic, right? But the third reason here is that like we tell you that like if the police have the ability to arrange these experiments in a controlled setting and to predict where they are, then we say that they can just arrest them the normal conventional way. There's no reason why it should be intrusive, right? Here's the way up. We could have intrusive policing, or you could have policing that is encompasses, that doesn't result in politicization, and doesn't mess up black people. I am proud to oppose.